Get that window out of the way. Gotta click over here, my other identity. Okay. Post-production. The third step in finishing your product or your project. Take two. Post-production, the third step in finishing your project. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that your first two steps are pre-production and production, and your final step is post-production. All right, so that's the third step in finishing your project. Can't get that out of my head. So what is pre-production, right? It's the idea, it's the writing, it's your pre-visualization like storyboards, etc. It's your production planning, your budgeting, that kind of stuff. What's production? Pretty straightforward, on location and or in the studio, shooting, directing, lighting, field, sound, recording, right? All the capture steps. Post-production is your editing, your music, your graphics, and more. Typically, music is not part of production unless it's live. I mean, there is an exception for music because you can have music live in an event. But music I'm talking about is the music that has been composed or selected for your project. All right. So the important, and remember, the last but not least, the most important phase of post-production, and this is the one that's really important to you as entrepreneurs and employees and contractors, is delivery. All right. If you don't deliver your project on time or deliver it at all, you don't get paid. And I say this with a lot of emphasis because there are specific contracts written in the industry that will specify hard delivery times and dates. And if you miss those times and dates, penalties begin to accrue. So this is one of the reasons why instructors can be very hardcore about timing, because in the industry, you don't get a practice round of, oh, well, you said you wanted it at midnight, but I didn't get it. I didn't start downloading till midnight. And it wasn't finished till 12:30. Well, then there's a penalty. You'll get a penalty. And remember, people are jerky, which is a polite way of saying they can be a-holes, and they will try to find ways to not pay you, right? This business is particularly salted with, and I don't really want to say overemphasize, there's too many of these kinds of people, but this business is sort of seasoned with a few people who would like to take advantage of other people. They don't want to pay you very much. Some of you may have already run across the dreaded, oh, well, we'll do it. You'll do it for the experience. Come on in and edit for my project for free. Oh, but you'll get the experience and you can put it on your resume, right? Well, you can't take your experience, to the restaurant or to the supermarket or anywhere and spend it, right? So always be careful about that. Anyway, that's a sidebar. So this is what I'm saying. If you don't deliver it or deliver it late, it could fail. So who's responsible in post? The post supervisor. Now, oftentimes in a small production, there isn't such a person, but someone is usually doing that job. My recommendation to you as students is that you appoint somebody, even if you don't make them the official post supervisor, that you let one person control post. Because if you don't, as we all know, everybody wants to drive the bus. There's only one steering wheel on the bus, and then there's trouble. There's fighting about what direction you're going to go in, okay? So it's always good to have somebody in charge of each phase. So as an example of this, the director is in charge of production, generally speaking. You take all your orders and your direction from the director, and we understand that. But the problem happens in a lot of productions is once directing is over and we get into post, especially again with new people, everybody has their ideas, and that's great to have ideas, but then the directions can change left and right. And I don't know if you guys have experienced this yet, but projects can take forever in post because you're constantly going back and forth. So somebody has to kind of take the reins, either formally or not, in my humble opinion. This is not to say you can't collaborate. It's just to say that, so if you've decided you want to have a group where everyone agrees and has a sort of a collegial approach, then my recommendation to you is one person is the action person from that group. So you all agree on a decision, but you nominate one person to be the person who makes sure that that agreement follows through. All right. So what is post-production? Okay, here's some tasks in post, and they start actually on the shooting day with something called daily. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Things like pickups and reshoots. So pickups and reshoots are when you have to go back and get stuff you missed. So remember earlier I said, you wish you had a shot of that car going past, or you wish you had the shot of that building. That's what pickups and reshoots are, is when you go back and get those shots. When you do this, it's really only because that shot is crucial or fatal to your production if you don't have it. So don't get into the habit of doing pickups and reshoots because they can be expensive and they can slow everything down. However, it's always a good idea to remember that there's nothing stopping you from going back and getting another shot. Okay. Remember too, by the way, if you do pickups and reshoots, you got to match your cameras. So don't just take any old camera and get the shot. You need to make sure the shots are seamless, right? We were talking before about editing and color correction. You've got to make sure your cameras match as closely as possible. So always try and do your pickups and reshoots with the same camera that you used for the original shot. Editing, straightforward. Again, rough cut, director's cut, picture lock. We'll go into this in more detail. The online assembly edit is after picture lock, ironically, and we'll talk about that as well. And then there's spotting, music, and sound effects. Oh, wait, but there's more because of audio, right? We introduced that with spotting. Now, spotting, in case you aren't sure or don't know, spotting is when you sit there and watch the entire project from start to finish at regular speed. And again, I caution you not to skip through it because you could miss things. And you make a list of all the stuff you need for audio. So that includes missing dialogue, dialogue that's been drowned out by background sound that you have to pick up in the studio, music hits where you want stings of music. And stings are those little music, sound ups where you have a sudden sound up for an effect, a dramatic effect, music scoring, where you're going to put replace music, for example, that you want to put in the video, such as a performance. That's all done during spotting. And spotting, you should have a serious pad of notes with all the time codes written down so you know where things are going to go, because when you get into audio post, you need to give these notes to somebody because they weren't there at the spotting session, right? Generally speaking. And what do you do in audio post? You do ADR, which is automated dialogue replacement, or looping. Now, both of those things are similar, and what they are is someone stands in a studio, watches a screen with the original footage on it, and reads their dialogue again, right? And why do they do that? Because again, out in the field, you had a microphone failure, or you do not do ADR and looping to change dialogue, because you're going to get lip sync problems, right? Because you're watching the screen and you have to, the performer has to do as close as possible performance to the original, because you're going to see that on screen. So the mouth has to move the same way. And we'll talk a bit more about that in some detail. Scoring is writing original music. Okay, that is scoring. Scoring is not taking taking music from libraries. So scoring is when you sit there and have a composer watch the production and write music to the production. Okay. A famous example of that, for those that may or may not know, is the Seinfeld I think it was the first 6 seasons of Seinfeld, 7 seasons of Seinfeld that they made back in the 90s. Every single opening had a different composition for the theme, because the theme was designed to make certain bass beats hit when Jerry Seinfeld would tell a joke or the audience would laugh. Because if you don't know the Seinfeld show, the beginning of the show used to start off with him in a nightclub telling a stand-up routine, and then they would cut to the action of the sitcom. Well, that opening music was different for every single performance for about 6 years. So that's pretty dedicated scoring. That's not very common. Most of the time it's just a one-off deal. Color correction is also a post task. Titling and visual effects mixing in. So this is where you take your visual effects that you've done offline somewhere else and you blend them in. Your titling is just your graphics and fonts on the screen. Now, layback is when you take the audio that you've manipulated in the ADR looping and scoring and you actually lay it down on the final sequence. Then you have a quality control screening where everybody watches it and everyone makes notes, and then you compare notes at the end to make sure that nothing got missed, no flash frames, no color problems. You have a final screening to make sure that the client's happy, and then you deliver it. Okay, so there's your post tasks. So what does it tell you? It tells you that post-production is planning, right? It's really a planning exercise as much as it is all these tasks. They have to be done in a certain order. This is one of the dogmas of post, is you really have to do things. It has a flow that you have to go through, and we'll get into that in some detail. It's also scheduling, right? Because in order for you to make that delivery time, you have to backdate. Right. And I don't know if you guys have done backdating or back timing, but it's really crucial that if you're delivering something, on this case, on the 21st on this calendar, that's your final drop dead, what they call a drop dead date, which means after that, nothing can happen. It has to be delivered. All your tasks that have to be done before that from this list right, have to be done before that date. Post is expensive. It's the second most expensive item in your production most times. And expensive, not necessarily in cash, but in time, and eventually time will become cash because you'll be paying people. But right now, you're probably finding, some of you may be finding that you're spending more time in post than you are shooting, right? And that is always, that's very common, right? So some of the Marvel movies will take 6 months in post. And remember, some of those movies are CGI heavy. There's lots of posts where they've only shot for 6 weeks, right? But then they go 6 months in post. So it can be the most expensive thing. So it's budgeting as well, right? Just get ready to spend money when you do post. And again, money or time. In your case, if it's free, you're not getting paid for it, then it's time. So what do you budget for? Editing. There's have enough time for editing. And this editing I'm talking about is not just your finished editing, but your story editing. Getting your timeline in story order. All that kind of stuff takes a lot of time. It's one of the most creative parts of the whole process. It's the place where you tell your story. So in other words, a lot of people think that they tell their story in production, that they write a script. I've told my story. The director's going to take my story and realize my story. And then the editor is just going to put that together. But what's really happening is the writer is providing the raw material for the story, which is this dialogue. We don't know yet when the story is written, whether it is even possible to film it, right? You got to keep that in mind. A writer writes a script. They're not constrained by, an example, Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible hanging off the side of the Burj Khalifa, right, in Dubai, was written into the script somewhere before the thing was shot. Now you get to the director's stage, the director says, we can't do that, right? We can't hang someone off the side of a building. Now, in the case of Tom Cruise, they ended up doing that because they spent the time and money. And if you've probably seen lots of BTS videos of Tom Cruise flying on ropes off the Burj Khalifa, 1,100 stories up off the ground or whatever it is, some crazy number, 1,100 meters off the ground. Anyway, the point of this is writers aren't constrained by reality. Directors are more constrained by reality because they have the script and then they have to make it work. They've got to shoot it. But, and this is where I'm going with this, the editor is the one that takes the script and the shots. And when I say the script, in the case of editing, it's already been spoken. It's now dialogue. And they actually build the story. Okay. So this is where your storytelling is done. So you need lots of time for that. And you need special software and equipment. And you guys know this already, Premiere, Avid, Resolve, a laptop or a computer powerful enough to handle it, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing you got to budget for is titling, like credits and opening titles. It's not a very big thing, but you got to make sure you have it. And graphics. Now, this can be huge because graphics are, again, a very creative, artistic element. And the person designing the graphics is taking somebody's notes and designing something from scratch, right? Or they're taking a graphic they've downloaded and modifying it. And as you guys know, anyone who's done any graphics work knows that can take forever as well. Budget for sound. Make sure you've got, and this is post we're talking about, make sure you've got your sound budgeted for. And now when I talk about budgeting for sound, one of the things you got to remember when you have ADR built in, and everybody does this in the industry, is they have to have the actor. The performer has to be there, right? So you've shot something a week ago, you screen it and realize, hey, we got to replace that dialogue. You have to get the performer back. So in a professional production, you always build in a few days of performer time as well, because they have to be brought back and you've got to make sure they're available. So it's always a good habit to get into when you finish a shoot with a performer, you've had their last day and you've all done the clap, 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 thanks for coming out, that you walk over and ask them, hey, look, are you available next week or in a couple of weeks for some ADR if we need you? Right? If they're not, you've got a problem. So you need to nail that down. And then there's the sound mixing, the layback, the visual effects, which can also be a gigantic element depending on the nature of your story. And then what's called delivery elements. And everyone thinks that, well, all I have to do is submit my video and I'm done. No. You guys have known this probably from Cindy's class. There's paperwork that has to be done, reports, music reports, clearance reports, copyright reports. All that is part of your deliverables, right? Sometimes the client wants the raw files. They want certain footage. This is all part of the deliverables. Simply downloading or delivering your final cut isn't the end of delivery until you've delivered everything. So again, read your agreements, Have you guys dealt with deliverables yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So what happens when I talk for a long time, everybody kind of tunes out. That's good, because so you understand that deliverables are there's a bunch of stuff. So when you have delivery requirements in a contract, what that means is it's not just the video. Everything has to be delivered or you don't get paid, right? So let's go through some of the steps kind of in brief. Dailies. Dailies is an important starting point for post because you screen all the footage you shot at the end of each day. All right. Now, it's really easy and it can be quicker to screen just the take you liked. So again, you guys have probably dealt with circle takes. Yes, no? I'm going to say yes and carry on. Circle takes, you should normally have more than one circle take, is what I guess what I'm getting at. What often happens is people pick the best take, circle it, and that's it, moving on, right? The problem is when you get into post and that circle take, you catch an error in it and you don't have it. So it's always a good idea to have like a good, better, best, first, second, third circle take. What often happens, and you'll see this in the industry, and you might have done this yourselves already, is something called one more for safety. You guys heard this concept? And one more for safety means you've got your circle take, you love it, but you want to do another one. Okay, it's so common. It's almost, people don't even talk about it because it just happens automatically. But for you guys, you may not know this, and so you should know that once you're happy, you've got the perfect take, do it again, one more time. Okay, and the reason we say, excuse me, one more for safety is because a lot of people think, and the crew and the actors, particularly the actors who aren't familiar maybe with production techniques, that getting the perfect take means the race is over and everybody relaxes, right? It's like a hockey game. You score the winning goal and you think that's it, game's over. Except remember, the clock is still running. The other team can grab the puck and score again, right? So the same is true in film. If you get a take you love, always get another take for two reasons. One, the energy is already up. You've got a good take. You're probably going to get another take that's equally good. And two, you'll have a second option in case something goes bad later on. So in dailies, you start screening your circle takes, okay? And make sure everything's fine in case you have to pick something up. So even if you said, yes, that's a golden take, it's always easy to forget details and continuity will happen or something will go bad. So always screen your takes at the end of the day. I would say before you release the crew, but that's not fair, but before the next shooting day for sure. All right. Now, if you've got a single shooting day, this doesn't really work for you, but you still want to screen them anyway. You don't want to go into editing without having looked at your shots, because you might have a chance, if you're a single shooting day project, you might have a chance to pick up some shots before you go into post. All right. So it's really important to look at your footage. Not all of it. And I think where people get overwhelmed with dailies is that they have to look at every single foot of I'm talking like it's film. Every single moment that's been shot. They don't. You have to look at the circle takes. That's your golden stuff. You can look at extra takes if you want to, but it's really crucial to make sure you looked at your circle takes before it goes into post. Otherwise, and the reason you want to do this, otherwise the editor starts making decisions based on what they're given. Remember what I said before about play the cards you're dealt. The editor's going to say, well, here's all I have. This is all I can do. Whereas if you're in the shooting position, the production position, you might be able to offer alternatives like other shots. Okay. And I just said all this. Oh, well, so what are you looking for, I guess? You're looking, so who's looking? Let's try this again. Why do you screen the shots? I didn't get into who's actually going to look. The director, the cinematographer, DOP, producers, and the actors. Sometimes some actors should not look at dailies because they get weird. People see themselves on the screen, they get weird, right? So you have to kind of know your actor, and often actors will refuse to look at their dailies, and that's fine. But the director, cinematographer, and producer should have a look, and you can check performance as well. Because remember, there's something else with any kind of dramatic reenactment. It's not just the technical stuff. It's how did it look? Did the person look natural? Were they stiff? Were they nervous? Were they, whatever, right? And then there's the aesthetics. Did you get the right lighting? And is the camera framed properly? Is the lighting okay? Is the camera in focus? These are all the things you're looking at in the because these are the things you can't fix in post. This is the other thing you do is you want to fix the stuff where you can fix it. You can't fix lighting in post. I mean, you know, there's tricks you can do with 3D lights and masking, and it takes forever. Sometimes it's quicker just to do another take in the field. Yeah, check for technical flaws. And you also get a chance, by the way, to adjust the story. You look at a daily, you look at a take and you go, you know, this isn't jiving with the script. The script, like we're going to go from shot A to shot B in the script, but the script doesn't do that. It doesn't make sense. So we either change the script and change the dialogue, or we change the order of the shots, right? This is a place where you can do those kinds of things when you screen dailies. Then, of course, the offline or the rough cut. Now, for a lot of you folks, I bet a lot of people start with the fine cut. And what the fine cut is the final cut and your final sequence. And when you get to the end of that sequence, you hand it in and you're done. I'm telling you that that's probably not a good practice because you get too worried about all the fine details. The best thing to do, and if you haven't done this already, start doing it, I would recommend, is jam the story together. So lay down all the shots and the audio in story order on the sequence. Forget the transitions, forget all the effects, just lay everything down from the start of the script to the end of the script on the sequence, right? And then watch it. It's forgetting that there's going to be bad edits, there's going to be all kinds of problems with it. Fair enough, this is a rough cut. All you're doing now in editing is making sure it actually works. Like, do you have all the pieces you need? Remember I said before about play the cards you're dealt. Well, do you have all the cards? And what often happens, and I'm guilty of this, you know, I'm not trying to lecture you guys without having some guilt in this myself, is you just want to get the thing finished and you start your first shot, you lay down your first shot in the sequence, and then you start basically building from the bottom as though you were building a house. You put the foundation down, then you start building the walls, and you put the windows in, you put the roof on, right? The problem with that is that you can lose sight of the story. You get halfway through the sequence and the story's not making any sense. And you spent hours getting that sequence because you don't want to go backwards, right? You're thinking to yourself, I don't want to go back and fix this. I'm going to fix it now. Well, then you get halfway through the thing and the story runs out of gas. So it's always good. And when I say story, don't confuse the fact that that this is a scripted concept. Everything has a story. You're editing something, you're making a video because there's a story. What if you're doing a makeup tutorial, right? What's the story? The story is, you know, put on your, you know, wash your face, put on your foundation, you know, put on your blush, put all the steps together, you know, lip liner, whatever you're going to do. And you build your face. If you're doing makeup for the face, you build your face all the way to the end. So lay all those shots down in that order and make sure they all work. Make sure the camera doesn't change angles. Make sure your elbow doesn't get in the shot partway through, right? Because that might not get caught on the shooting day because people aren't looking for those things. So I always recommend people do a rough cut, and a rough cut can be very rough. Now, the problem with the rough cut is, and there was a famous joke that went around the industry about 30 years ago. Some people can't understand a rough cut and they start picking it apart. They wonder why it's flashing to black, or, you know, why do we see the clapper board in the shot? Or it doesn't matter. It's a rough cut. We're just wanting to make sure the story makes any sense before. So if you want a metaphor of any kind, I like to use the lumber metaphor. And that is, you start with a tree, you cut the tree down, right? You then take the tree into a sawmill and you cut it into chunks. You take those chunks and you make them into boards. You take those boards and you sand them down into 2x4s, and then you're ready to go and build your house. The rough cut is all that part up to the sanding the 2x4s, right? So again, this is my personal piece of advice to you. As much as possible, try and work in the rough cut mode. You'll find it much more satisfying, I'll tell you, because first off, if you're a creative person, a storyteller, if you finish a rough cut, and you'll find you finish rough cuts, you can finish them fairly quickly. You'll have a complete story right in front of your face. And now you can play the story back as you're working. You can say, oh, okay, make a copy of the sequence, you know, keep it up to your side and just kind of refer to it if you need to when you're finishing up your edit. You can play the story back over and over again. Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Oh, hey, wait a minute, you know, we're missing a beat here. Or anyway, that's enough of me selling the rough cut. So just to recap what I said, get the narrative in order, right? Whatever the story might be, whether it's a makeup video, whether it's a documentary, whether it's just, so even if you're doing pretty pictures, if you're doing, you know, 2 or 3 minute video of just scenics of animals out in the wild, make sure you shoot it with a story in your head, right? And the story in your head for that kind of thing could be something as simple as, and now you don't put any of this in the actual video, but your brain is thinking as you're shooting, we're out here in the wild. What does that look like? It's a big mountain. Oh, look at that. There's a tree over there. In that tree, there's some interesting birds. Let's look and see what those birds are doing. So there's 3 or 4 shots right there. And you've set the scene. You've then focused on the object of interest, which is the tree and the birds. And so that there's a narrative. Everything has a narrative. And humans love stories. And if the story makes sense, you'll really engage people. Then you want to drop in temp, graphics, and VFX. Now, this is not in order, by the way. This list I'm giving you is not in order. So get the flow going, check the running time, make sure there's no gaps in the story. Don't worry about getting continuity exact. Look for major issues that have to be fixed in production, for example, reshot. When I say drop in temp, graphics, and VFX and music, and again, this is something people struggle with, is that they tend to want to put the final thing in. Don't. Just put in a graphic that says graphic goes here. Put in some music off the internet or off, one of your, whatever music source you might have, just to have music to fill it in, to get a level for audio. Don't worry about having the final music if it's not ready. If it's ready, throw it in. But if it's not, just put in temp stuff. Because again, in your rough cut, your whole point is flow. Make sure the flow is working, right? All right. Then finishing. So now is when you do another pass. So finishing, depending on your level of expertise and level of sophistication, is either a whole different room with a different person, in the case of films and television, or it's just you now doing your second pass. And now you're making sure that all your fine work is done. You're filling all the gaps. You're making sure that the shots work. You're timing your shots properly so that you hit the right beats. You're just doing all that proper editing, fine work. But remember, the story is already laid down. So you can start your finishing process by watching the sequence, that's rough cut sequence, and seeing the story already laid out. And so you know what you have to do now to make that story look smooth and polished. All right. Then you move on to sound in post. Sound is always after the picture. Let's go back here. So in your finishing work, here's where you lock your picture. Okay, so once you leave video edit finishing, your final cut, you don't make editorial changes to your image again. You keep your timeline intact. You have to, because everyone after you is going to depend on those timings. And if you start changing them later, it's going to screw everybody up. This is not to say you can't go back and revise, but it means you have to go back in all the steps and revise. Okay, so what I'm saying is when you finish your finishing, you've locked your picture, no more edits. Okay, then you go into sound. Now sound can do the dialogue replacement and sound effects, mixing, formatting. So the ADR is done with the final cut, right? So they're doing dialogue replacement based on the shots that have been selected, not the shots that have been screened. So ADR is done with final cut. Automated dialogue replacement is simply reading new lines over top of the old lines. That's all it really is. Sound effects, any kind of sound effects, gunshots, car backfires, birds, whatever it might be. Mixing, which is just leveling all your audio together, right? And then formatting. And formatting in audio means things like, is it stereo? Is it surround? Right? That's all done in audio post. Then you do your graphics. And again, these last steps after locked picture, these are not in any particular order. And graphics can actually start much, much earlier. In fact, it could start right at the beginning if you like, if you know what the graphics are going to be. Now, in this case, for my slide, I've selected a poster for the movie Vertigo, but in fact, the graphics are any graphic element on screen, and that can be CGI, right? Computer graphics, CGI. So any graphics will happen in post. They don't happen in production. You don't shoot your graphics, right? You create them afterwards, so they're part of post. So part of the post supervisor's job is to make sure the graphic artist or the graphic person is on time, because if they're late, everyone's waiting, right? That's why we go back to the temp graphics. If we talk about putting a temp graphics in finishing even, which you can do, right? If you don't have the graphics even by finishing, which is unlikely, you should have them mostly here. You just put in a placeholder, 30 seconds of action sequence here or something to keep the flow alive. And then you replace them with the final graphics at the end. This would be the exception to the lock picture rule, but typically graphics are silent unless they're animated where there's sound. If there's animation in the graphics and they're moving and there's going to be audio sound effects with them, then they have to be finished here. They've got to be finished before you start finishing, okay? Otherwise, they can be thrown in afterwards if you've put in a placeholder video in your timeline. CGI, again, right? We've covered that. And then you complete. So you put all your titles on and, you deliver your final product. Always, I don't know if you guys are doing this, but always have your titles on a separate video track, usually the top track, if possible, so you can turn it on and off, because sometimes you'll need to have what's called a title-free version, especially for international deliveries, but especially sometimes for festivals. They're going to want you to turn off all your titles and just give it to them clean. So put all your titles on the top 1 or 2 tracks and then deliver it. Hand it off with all your deliverables. So how about some tips about getting through posts? So I've given you some already, but let's give you a couple more. So check for continuity. Always have an eye when you're in, especially the rough cut phase and the fine cut phase, but everybody in post, even audio people, keep an eye out for continuity errors, because they're the one thing that people seem to miss. And because it's so natural to forget which hand someone held a coffee cup in, or, you shoot one shot at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then you shoot the same shot again in the afternoon, and the person's changed clothes. All this kind of stuff can happen. So always pay attention to continuity errors in post. Work backwards when you're planning, right? We talked about this before with scheduling. Start with your delivery date, and then work backwards. Budget for post and pre-production. We talked about this as well. Make sure you allow enough time for post. Don't just try to wing it. And because again, what often happens, especially when you're inexperienced, is you spend a lot of time in production because it's kind of fun and you're out there shooting, and it's kind of that. It's what everybody imagines filmmaking is sitting in the director's chair with Video Village, waving your arms around, and everyone's running around with their cameras. It's kind of fun. And edit and post is often just sitting in a dark room somewhere, working by yourself. But make sure you budget a proper time, because there's nothing worse than trying to squeeze post. As I said before, it can often be your most budget, your most time heavy part of your production. Have a realistic schedule. This kind of ties into the previous one. Just make sure you've thought about it, talked it over. Make sure the person doing your editing is confident they can deliver it when they say they can. A lot of times, as you probably know already, people will say things just to be, to make nice, to be pleasing. And you've got to really quiz people. Like, what do you mean you can do that in 3 days? How's that possible? Explain to me how you can do it. Yes, sometimes you have to do those things. Know your story. Everyone should know the story. I don't know if you guys have talked about this either in your other classes, but it's always a good idea that no matter who's involved on the crew in post, from pre-production to the end, everybody should know what the story is. And I mean the story that you're trying to tell in the video that you're making. Okay. Try to make changes on set as much as possible. If you don't like the story, it's not working, it's not flowing, do your alternate takes. Don't try to fix it in post, because you won't have the material, and it may not, the changes may not look as convincing. Also, make sure that all your gear will talk to each other. This is another common mistake that we run into, especially nowadays with all these various bits and sundry pieces of hardware and software, different recording mediums, all that kind of stuff. Do a dry run if you're not sure. Take your SD card, put 4K footage on it from the camera, run it to your laptop, make sure the laptop will ingest it, right? Like, for example, I'll give you a realistic example. My current laptop, which is a 2018 MacBook Pro, would probably cack if I ran too much 4K footage through it, just because it's got a very small SSD, because that's all that was available back in the old days of 2018. I know, listen, the old days of 2018. Anyway, so I would be reluctant to edit in 4K on my laptop, but I know that because I tried. So make sure you've tried these things. Don't just assume it's all going to work. A lot of times people get caught up, and this is what separates pros from amateurs. Professionals test, amateurs hope, right? Amateurs hope it's going to work. And when it doesn't work, everyone looks bad. Professionals test it's going to work. And then when it doesn't work, they know what went wrong and they can try something else. Okay. Remember that everyone's doing their bit. Nobody's unimportant in post, from graphics to whether you're just doing, audio mixing, listen to me, already minimizing it. Everyone's doing their bit, right? They're all important roles, and treat people accordingly. If you feel good, you'll work better. So just keep that in mind. And I said, bookend your schedule. I'm repeating myself again. Post starts on the first shoot day, and it ends when the product is delivered. And I say that because post doesn't post planning starts before that, but the actual work of post begins with those dailies. Okay. Know your dates, write them down, make sure the team knows, make sure everybody knows your dates, have your milestone dates. If you're a producer, because remember, it's not the director that's in charge of the production, it's a producer. So if you're a producer, you want to say, okay, look, we're shooting on Wednesday. I want to have a rough cut by the following Wednesday. Give people deadlines. People like to be led. Yeah, I shouldn't say people want to be led. I shouldn't say they like to be led. People want to be led, and it's very helpful to draw a box around people because it helps them know what the boundaries are, what they have to meet, what the goals are, right? If you just say to people, well, give it to me when you're done. Remember what I said about editing, right? You're never finished. You just run out of time. That time is part of that box. So make sure the team knows what the goals are. And then some more technical tips. When you're before you're shooting, make sure you have the framing requirements, frame rates, edit specs. The number and types of elements means the various video and audio bits. So not everything you're going to put in your sequence was shot. Some of the stuff you put in your sequence is stock footage, graphics off the internet, custom made graphics, audio, sound, music, right? Make sure that's all listed and you've got it all accounted for. Don't just give the post person a recording thing like an SD card and say go, right? Because that's terrible. Because they're going to come back to, well, I need this shot, I need that shot. You should know that. You should never be surprised unless there's a fault in the timeline by an editor. You should never be in a situation where your editor is telling you, I need stuff, I don't have it. You should have given them as much as you can, right? And a good editor will work with that, and an editor will appreciate your skill if when you give them everything, it's all prepared and ready to go. Make sure you use a chip chart at least a couple of times in your shoot. I would say every take, every setup. Whenever you change lighting and position, throw up the chip chart, because your colorist will worship at your feet if you do that, because the colorist needs a reference. Remember we talked about color correction, and you need to have references. Well, the only reference is a chart. You can't trust the environment, because the environment could have exposure, color temperature. There's all kinds of issues that can happen in the environment that you're shooting in. But if you throw a chart up, even a gray chart, right? A gray card is enough, because gray, remember we talked about coloring, gray will show up color cast. So if you have a neutral gray card and you throw it up on the screen and it's a bit red or a bit green, that'll tell the colorist something, and that gives them a base to work on. White balance, if you're not shooting in RAW, even if you are, I would still do white balance anyway, even though RAW doesn't necessarily record white balance. I would white balance, because make sure you white balance. It's way faster in the field. It's a few seconds in the field compared to fumbling around in post. Because remember, into white balance in post or in color correction, because color correction is also part of post, you've got to find a white object in the screen, and they're not always there, right? If you shoot in a room, like if you shoot in the room that I'm in right now, I'm looking around my room, there aren't very many white objects that you could use to white balance with. So, and you can only white balance, just so we're clear, if you can tell the camera or the software what white's supposed to look like. And if you don't have anything in the object in the screen that's white, you can't do that, right? Communicate effectively. Make sure you have visual references. So here's an important thing to remember if you're a producer or you're a writer. It's always handy if you have some mental pictures in your head to try and find some physical representation of that, because you're the only one that knows in your mind what's going to look like what you're thinking. But what often happens is someone will say, and I've heard this, I even heard this just the other day from a student, someone will say things like, oh, it's going to be like Quentin Tarantino. Okay, which movie, right? What part of which movie? So what the person saying that, the Quentin Tarantino reference, or the Wes Anderson reference, or whoever you choose, has an image in their head when they're saying it. So they might be thinking about Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill, but all those movies have different looks. They're not the same. Tarantino doesn't take the same look from film to film. Even a guy like Wes Anderson, who does some very iconic color work and stuff, doesn't take the exact same look from film to film. So if you're telling somebody, I want it to look like blah, 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 provide them an image. Give them what's called a reference frame. Take a frame from, and you saw that when we did the color correction. We had that mountain scene from Hateful Eight with the color palette at the bottom. Do that. You give someone an image. So if you're doing graphics and someone says, hey, I want something that looks kind of like the 60s. Okay, well, I can tell you as a guy who lived through the 60s, that the 60s were 10 years of very differing art styles. The problem, of course, is that we get into the shorthand where someone will say the 60s, and all they can think of is the hippie era. and the psychedelic art, and then you do a story about 1960, let's say 64, I don't know whether it's a civil rights documentary or something, and you include these psychedelic artworks, which wouldn't have been there at 1964 because the psychedelic era didn't happen until later. So you've got to say to someone, when I mean the 60s, I mean early 60s, I mean corporate looks, I mean whatever. So give people, because we're all visual thinkers and learners, give people visual references wherever possible. You'll and even have them, and you'll find this production designers will often make up what's called scrapbooks. What's called scrapbooks? What am I saying? They'll make up scrapbooks and they will put a bunch of images in them, and you can refer to them all the time. You can always open the book and say, oh, these are the kind of cars we're looking at. This is the kind of architecture that we're going to be shooting around, right? So you don't accidentally capture, you're out in the street shooting a shot, you're panning around the street, and you accidentally capture a 1980s house when you're doing this 1960s production. The DOP knows, you know what, that house isn't part of our style, so we'll avoid that shot. We'll reframe the shot to get rid of that. So there you go. Use safe action in the viewfinder if you have an option to do that. It always helps you turn on that option in your viewfinder so you can see what's going to be protected and not going to run off the edge of the screen. Remember your frame rates, right? Try not to change frame rates cavalierly. Frame rates are like resolution. You basically pick it when you start the project. I think we talked about this way back. Pick a frame rate and stay with it, right? The challenge is a lot of people pick 23,976 or 24 frame, and then they end up showing it on computers and stuff that make it 30 or 60 frame. Only choose the frame rate that you're going to display it on at the end. So if you're not going to display your project in 24p, and I say this because a lot of students in the past have done this, and they dynamite themselves in the foot. So they'll shoot 24 frame, and when you ask, well, why? Well, because movies are all shot in 24, right? But movies are displayed in 24, and then they show it in class, or they give it to an instructor, and it's been transcoded and output, and it's been transcoded into a 30 frame format like HD, right? HD is not necessarily a 24 frame format. It could be, but what happens is there's 6 frames missing every second, right? So now those frames get smeared and blurred and whatever. So all I'm cautioning you about is when you pick a frame rate, make sure that's your delivery frame rate. Don't shoot in one frame rate and deliver in another if you can help it. You can't always help it, but try not to do that. Anyway. So let's run through a quick post schedule then. All right, this is a very rough idea of how post will go. We're going to make a couple of assumptions. One is that the tasks sometimes run simultaneously. So this is not a rock hard schedule. It's just going to give you a rough idea. We also assume that in this post schedule that primary photography is over. That means you've got all the shots you need, including all your pickups, right? You've picked up all your shots. And then we're assuming a 30 to 60 minute runtime on your project. This is kind of what this, I had to have some boundaries to make this. Remember, you had to draw a box around everything. Okay, so week 1, you get your files, converted raw files from the DIT, right? You shot raw, your DIT's done their magic. You digitize and import your files into your editing, right? You make in other words, you create your bins and import all your media. You sync your dailies. You start putting your separate audio tracks onto your pictures so that your editor has audio and video together. This is why you sync dailies. If you've recorded on a Tascam recorder and you've got your camera audio, you have to sync them together before you give them to the editor. You should sync them together. So the editor's not doing it. You don't want the editor to be sitting there working on syncing up clips, right? Then screen them. Once you've got the audio synced with it, screen them. And then the editing cut begins. The rough cut begins. Then in week 2, now remember these weeks, you're not going to say you cut something in a week. This is just sort of a step 1, step 2, if you'd like. But I've called them week 1 and 2 just to confuse you some more. So then once you finish the editor's cut, this will be the rough cut that the editor's done. The director gives you notes, right? And what that means is the director looks at the rough cut and says, story's not working. We're going to have to rearrange this, shooting order. We're going to do a bunch of stuff. Then you do what's called the director's cut, right? And the director's cut is sort of a version of the fine cut, where you start getting more detail. So the rough cut is done essentially unsupervised. The director's cut, you've shown it to somebody. You've shown your rough cut to someone, right? And then they've come back with some notes. The rough cut, it's like the tree example. You don't get to the finished 2x4 without a few steps in between. The rough cut isn't just a single step. It's a step of honing. Okay. Then you look at your, well, interview composers. So that's just line up your composer, get your sound designers, ready to go. And then you continue your edit. You start getting your credits ready, get all your people's names spelled correctly, right? We all know, even people like me who've got fairly short last names, you wouldn't believe how many times it gets messed up. And it's very important, and it can be very bruising to someone's ego to get their name wrong, as I say, we all know. So make sure you get the credits right, get the name right, get the title right? Get all that stuff together. Make sure you collect everybody. And by the way, when you talk about preparing credits, here's where you decide who gets a credit and who doesn't. So some productions credit every single person. Some productions only credit key people. Make that decision here. Don't make it as you go. Start your VFX work, your visual effects work. Okay, then continue cutting. So you'll notice, right? We're doing the edit. We've done the rough cut in the first early portion. The director's cut began in week 2, quote unquote, week 2, second step, but it continues all the way along, right? It's carrying on. We're still cutting. Okay, so then once you've done that, you screen it. Once the director's more or less happy, you have a look at it. It's still not the fine cut yet, right? This is the director's cut. We have a look at it. You continue doing your VFX because that's carrying on. These are all in parallel. Then you start the second version of the director's cut, because people now the directors had other people look at it. The producer and the actors have looked at it, and you do another pass, right? Then you continue preparing your credits, do your visual effects. You plan all your pickup shots, because now you know for sure what shots you're missing, what you have to do. And you can see this is a few steps in, right? Because you want to make sure you don't want to book a crew and do pickup shots unless you're absolutely sure you cannot fix it in post, right? So you do your pickups. You then send that you've locked your picture at some point, and you send the cut to the composer. I'm sorry, you haven't locked your picture. What am I saying? You send the director's cut to the composer so they can begin composing. At this point, they're not going to be composing note for frame, but what they're going to do is they're going to start composing sort of mood. They're going to start writing music and then going back and forth with the director. Is this what you think? Is that what you want? Is this too scary? Right? That's what happens here with the composer. Shoot your pickups. So go back and get your footage that you just absolutely must have in your shot. And then do that first week again, quickly digitize and sync your pickups. And then you finish your director's cut. Okay, then you lock your picture. Once the director's happy, and I always say cut number 2 because it usually takes two passes. It can take more, depends on the director. Some directors get it in 1, right? But whatever it is, once you've done that, you declare the picture's locked. No more editing, everybody. You blow the whistle. That's it. We're done. You have to do that, or people think they can keep editing the project until it's delivered. And you can't. You can't. But you will. I'm saying you can't, but you will. Come on, we know that. All right. Then you throw in your titles, your effects. You're making your dubs now because you've got locked picture for sound and music, and you send those off to the various departments. You can export your audio files, AAF in this case, but any file you'd like for sound. Create an EDL if that's necessary. That may not be. Check your deliverables. Sometimes they want an edit list. I don't know why anymore, but nonetheless, it might be a deliverable. Then what happens after this is you do your spotting sessions. Now you've got a locked picture. We do our spotting. We look for music and sound effects to go in. And I've sat in on these, and they can be sometimes a very long session of watching and making notes. Then your sound designer begins the dialogue and effects. And dialogue and effects, what that means is they start taking the dialogue that's been recorded and the audio sound effects and mixing them together. And they need to balance and be timed out properly. Then you do Foley sessions. You guys know what Foley is, which is the live sound effects. You do a scoring session. Sometimes a scoring session can be with an orchestra. Sometimes it's a single musician. Sometimes you just get handed a file. So scoring sessions can vary widely. You'll have an ADR session near the end when everything's mixed and you now have a version you can have an actor read to. Now, ADR sessions, having it in this late in the process, it really depends on when your actor's available. You may have to do it much earlier if that's when they're around, right? The problem with doing it before lock picture is you may have to ADR multiple takes because you may not know which one's the final version, right? It's always best to wait until the picture's locked. to have your actors come and do their dialogue. You then finish your sound editing, do your mix. And the mix is simply balancing all the audio sources together. And then you do what's called an online, which means your final versioning, so that you've got your final high res copy. So if for example, you shot in 4K, but you've been working all this time in HD because your laptop can't handle 4K, you've been using proxies. Now is the time when you do your up-res, right? Because you're going to work on your color grading with the final footage. You can't color grade with proxies, right? Or you shouldn't. And then you export. You can export an edit list for the color session, but nowadays we often export the entire sequence. Just make a copy of the sequence when you do that. So when you see export AAF, that's an Avid style of edit decision-making list, but you can just give them the entire sequence as long as you name it, so a color correction or something. Then you start getting your deliverables ready, because now you've got all your stuff done. You can start filling in your documentation because you know what footage you're using, who the actors were. You then do a quality control screening just to make sure that you've not missed anything, right? Everyone has a look at this. The quality control screening at the end is everyone's there, colorist, sound, everyone's there, right? We're all checking everything we've done. Now, again, in your situation, it's probably going to be just the 4 of you or 5 of you or whatever your team is, but you should all be there for the final screening. And then the final screening is for clients, typically. So producers, directors, instructors, maybe, depending on who your audience is. And then your deliverables are presented. Okay, and that's done. There's your post timeline. I'm just going to pause for a second here. All right. Oh, okay. So audio post, I'll give a little bit of focus to. Gives you so what can you do in audio post? Now you guys are working with I imagine with Sia. I'm not sure if you've had him yet or not, but the kind of things that he'll be talking to you about in audio post training, if you haven't had it yet, is what can you fix in audio post, right? Why would you do audio post? Why not just do all your audio in Premiere or in Avid? Well, because audio post, you have better tools. You have mixing consoles. You have, you should have anyway to do it properly. So you can make smoother, more dynamic audio. You have more audio filters and effects. You can make your dialogue sound better. You can mix your surround better in audio post as a separate step. So you're imagining that you've done your video edit, right? And you're into audio post now, playing with your audio. So you can set your mix levels. You just got way more tools. Avid and Premiere and Resolve, for that matter, have very limited audio repair and audio editing tools. All right, so that's just a bit of a pitch for doing audio post. And again, ADR, this is an example here of an ADR studio where you've got a microphone in front of a big screen. The bigger the screen, the better, by the way, so that the actor can see the mouths and lips moving, because they have to move theirs in synchronization with what's already been shot. Okay, this is sometimes called looping or dubbing. Then Foley, and I realize now that I'm talking to you, these slides are out of order. They should have been before the final list I gave you, but nonetheless, here we are playing the cards that were dealt. So Foley is using actual objects. So this is a scene where someone's riding a bicycle, and there's somebody with a bicycle making the chain noises and maybe applying the brake and all those kind of things. Foley is much more accurate than canned sound effects because the timing can be right, and you can even get atmosphere when you're recording in Foley. And then you'll make a list if you're having to do deliverables. This is called a pull list. And what this is in the screening that you did before audio post, you made a list of all the sounds you want. So you had your audio person when you did your spotting. Remember we talked about spotting? This is the list that comes out of spotting. And they'll make a bunch of lists. We need wood smash 1 and wood smash 2. And so oftentimes they're numbered because there's a different sound. So chair squeak 1 and chair squeak 2 doesn't mean that it's one after the other. It means that chair squeak 1 is a specific chair squeak, and chair squeak 2 is another one. So you're going to blend the two of them together. So you make a pull list, and then your music and scoring. Again, you've got a screen, you've got your sheet music there, and someone's working away on a keyboard. But by the way, we talk about music and scoring. There's 3 types of music in a film, in a project. There's the underscore, and that's that music you hear in the background, running around, setting the mood and doing all those things. There's the hit song, which is a pre-existing song recorded from another source, usually a hit song, like a well-known song that's used for effect or for atmosphere. And then there's custom music, right? And this is something composed for the project specifically. And it can be a music or a song. So custom music, so just so we're differentiating custom music from the underscore is that music that goes along in the background, that kind of thumping bass, or that, the violins or whatever that happen, whatever is going on is part of the scene. The custom music is music that's in the foreground. When I talk about custom music or song, that is like a musical. Is a good example. It's a musical. So you have a musical like Frozen, right? And the songs they're singing are custom made for that movie. They're not a hit song. They will become a hit song one day. But those are the kind of things I'm talking about when I say custom music and song. And then, of course, you've probably talked with Cindy about having to do reports and cue sheets for all that kind of stuff. These are all parts of your deliverables. And here, by the way, is an example of, this is old now, 2012, but here's an example of a delivery requirement sheet that you'll get. Now, we used to give out to students back in the day. I don't know if you guys are getting those now, but I won't go through the entire thing, but you'll see things like on the left is the columns of requirements, right? And then on the far right are the notes. So you'll have things like the file's got to be ProRes 422. The file name has to have this format, production number, underscore name, underscore title. The format of the video has to be 1920, 1080, excuse me, etc. That's basically what's going on there. Oh, and that's it. Yeah, so those last couple of slides are a bit out of order, and I'm sorry for that. I'll just stop the share, stop the recording.